Thank you. We're going to need to move on to the next item on the agenda, and we'll have time at the end for discussion with us as a group. Next on the agenda is policy issues for online expansion, and I'd like to introduce David Longenecker, who's the president of the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education. David, welcome.
Well, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here, and I applaud the state of Florida for this work, and I applaud the Parthenon Group for a very fine study that they have done for you. I'm going to talk about how policy supports the practice of online learning and some of the things that you need to take into account as you do that. So I'll start by saying that it appears to me, I've been the state higher education executive in 2 states, and I currently work with 15 other ones, and almost every state has pretty much the same policy processes. They're interested. They use finance as a policy strategy. They use quality assurance and accountability. They focus on support of innovation in their system, and they look at the institutional vitality within their system. And I'm presuming that your policies focus more or less along those same lines. But before I jump into those 4 areas and talk about them, I want to start you where I think you have to start, and that is what your policy goals are. I'm presuming what you're after, and this is very consistent with what the Parthenon Group said, is that you want high-quality educational opportunities for your citizens. You want that to be accessible to your citizens. You want it to be workforce relevant to the citizens of your state, and you want it to be provided cost-effectively in your state. That's really important in Florida because you're a fairly frugal state, I've noticed. And so those are, I think, consistent goals with respect to your activities. But I also hear in this, and I think it's really important for you to figure out where you are on a couple of other potential goals, which is whether you want to serve Florida or you want to serve the world, and have your institutions do that. And the other is whether you want your online activities to be, what kind of cost structure? Do you want them to, if you will, be a profit center for you? And it seems to me those are sort of underlying goals as I've read some of the material. So let me go back then to these 4 processes. But before I do that, let me just say that I think when we do policy, generally our policies sort of fall into one of 3 general approaches. Either a benign approach, what we're doing is just fine, whatever, being directive, or being supportive. And I don't put those up to be pejorative, or I think all 3 have an appropriate place in public policy. Sometimes we want to tell people how to do it exactly my way. Other times we want them just to accomplish it. So I'm going to move first into the finance policies and the way in which we do finance policy and how that might affect online learning. But basically, our finance policies in the public arena are to essentially try to find a way of balancing the resources for the public good and the private benefit. And we do that basically in the way we appropriate monies to our institutions, the tuition policies that we develop to generate to complement our public appropriations, and our financial aid programs and how they fit together at AFA, at which we call that AFA, Appropriations, Tuition, and Financial Aid Policy. We encourage people, when they think of one of those, to always think of the others because they are so closely interrelated to achieve your objectives. Whoops, I pushed the wrong thing. So let me go into the finance on the institutional side or the supply side. What you do here is how much online education you will get and of what quality. And one of the ways we do that is essentially by paying for desired activities. We'll put a pot of money out there for student services because we want student services attended to. We'll put a pot of money out there for online services because we want to get some online services. We'll put a pot of money out there for enrollments because we want more enrollments. It's mostly focused on trying to buy activities, processes that will lead to the outcomes that we want. But it's a process-oriented funding strategy. The other primary strategy we use is to pay for desired outcomes. This is more along the supportive. We say we want you to graduate students, and we want you to reduce equity gaps. Those are the 2 big ones that public policy is focused on in many states today. and so we say, we will pay you if you achieve those successes. And both, frankly, of those current agendas, improving completion of students and reducing equity gaps, are important for online learning because our hunches are that online education is not as good in those two areas as campus-based learning. And so those are very important things from a public policy perspective to keep in mind: completion and reducing equity gaps. On the demand side, that's where we talk about tuition and financial aid. While tuition is a revenue source for the institutions, it is also something the students and their families have to come up with, and financial aid. So those are important. And we generally have approached this in public policy through three different strategies, or are today. There's a lot in play today. One is that there's shared benefits, public and private, and so the cost should be shared. Second is student benefits, so the student should pay. And the third is try to use this as a way to change the cost curve. Talk very briefly about each one of those. On the first one, which is the public good and the private return are both in this investment, and there ought to be some balance, is more or less what we do today. This is pretty much what we do today, and it's not really a change strategy, but that's not necessarily bad. If you're satisfied with what you've got, then that's not a bad strategy. Second one is essentially if the student's the principal beneficiary, and much of the online is focused on returns on investment for economic reasons for the student. So if the student's going to be the principal beneficiary, maybe they should pay. This is really a market-driven process where you charge the students what the market will bear. The impact on this, however, can be as significant on the institution as it is on the students. Students, by and large, most of our research shows that except for low-income students, students are relatively, their demand for higher education is relatively price inelastic. That is, they will go to college, they will pay for it. They will bitch and moan about it, but they will pay for it. That's not true for needy students. Needy students require financial aid. So if you go to this model, you have to benefit, and you are concerned about the equity gaps, you're going to have to do something on the need-based aid side, because otherwise you will simply have online education for the better off students. The third is really the cost effectiveness one, where you try to use low pricing. It's sort of the opposite of the market-based. You essentially try to depress the price for online students to drive the cost curve down, and you see this throughout the country. You had discussions about this, I know, in Florida. Texas has been working on the $10,000 degree. There are many places that are working on this strategy as a way to drive down the cost of college. And there are a variety of ways in which we do that. One is the new RAVE, which are the MOOCs. They certainly drive down the cost curve. They cost nothing, or supposedly cost nothing. The campus-based, another is the competency-based efforts that were reflected in the Parthenon study, that basically this is where you essentially do some assessment of the students' competencies, and you don't have to repeat those. So you do prior learning assessment and give credit for that. The third is where you look at basically trying to find the best in show courses and programs. There was some discussion of working with others in this regard, and I know that Bruce will be talking about this as well. But you can go out and buy some darn good courses that you could put into your curriculum, or you could partner with others and use the best that's available in that regard, and that can reduce your costs. Now, this is an incentive for students to choose the less expensive option. I said students were relatively price inelastic. What we don't know, because we don't have research on it, if that's true for adult students returning to school, and we don't know if it's true by course. We know it is by program and institution and degree, but we aren't sure by course. In fact, we've got some pretty strong evidence that students will take courses online during the summer and whatever to both save money and maybe get an easier course here or there. It could provide strong incentives to institutions. So on the finance policy, what I'd basically say is that finance is one of your strongest policy levers. It does make a difference in what institutions and students do, and you should be very sensitive to what you use, how you do your finance policies, but they can be very powerful levers if you use them effectively as you look at your future for online services. Second area I want to talk about was quality assurance and accountability. Essentially, what you're trying to do with accountability policies is assure students and society that they're getting value for what they're paying for, and that your institutions and your state are accountable for their responsibilities in this regard. And there are two current thrusts I want to talk a little bit about. One is student learning outcomes, and the other is student completion metrics. If we look first at student learning outcomes, in traditional higher education, for all practical purposes, this isn't an issue. We presume that what's offered on campus is a quality experience, and we accept that and go forward. But that's not the case for online learning. With respect to online and technology-mediated instruction, since its inception, we've had to prove whether it was valuable or not. And in fact, all the evidence is that it does work. Online learning, there's a tremendous amount of research that basically has looked at this and suggests that there's no significant difference in the student learning for an online experience than for a campus experience when everything is taken into account. So it's just as good as what we're doing on campus. There's even a substantial amount of literature now that suggests that technology-mediated learning, blended learning that we talk a lot about, can actually increase student learning, and sometimes at substantially less cost. So it does work. So if it works, how do we make it happen? How do we incentivize it? Well, the common thread in most of the discussion, the main thesis today, is sort of following Clayton Christensen's disruptive technology or disruptive innovation concepts. And his basic two themes are that change can't happen within an organization. It can only happen on the periphery of an organization. And that change doesn't do better, at least initially, but it will do good enough. What you'll get will be good enough and to serve the purpose. Now, that's not what everybody believes he says, but if you read his stuff, that's essentially what he says. I can't buy this, because this would argue that then basically 85% of what we do can't be changed, and you'll see that reflected in my comments throughout. I think there are generally four approaches to looking at student learning outcomes. One is to essentially disregard issues of quality, just like we do today in traditional. That's not going to probably happen here. One is to require that your institutions who do online learning essentially develop quality assurance assessments of student learning. The dilemma with this is it will not face the test of external validity. Folks will say they made up their own rules. That doesn't pass muster. The third is to require institutions to adopt externally developed assessments of student learning. To some extent, this is what the public universities have done through the voluntary system of accountability, what a number of online institutions did through the transparency by design assessments, which really allowed for institutions to use external methods to demonstrate their competence. And the fourth would be to do standard assessments of quality for all online learning, akin to what we've done in elementary and secondary education. And there are strengths and weaknesses for all of those. It's just that we need to be thinking about student learning outcomes as we look forward. Second one is around student completion, which is also very important at the present time for all forms of education, but it's particularly of importance with online learning. There's a perception that students who complete do just fine, but that too many of them don't complete, and you sort of saw this reflected in the Parthenon report. Now, there's evidence from the University of Central Florida, and I would tell you, incidentally, from our perspective at WICHE, we're a Western organization, but we have tentacles around the country through our WCET organization. We consider the University of Central Florida as a model institution for the delivery of online and blended education. It's a very strong institution in that regard. I'm sure there are others that are doing exceptional work in Florida, and I just don't know them. But I do know the University of Central Florida, and they do work. And they've done a very good amount of work on collecting data and data analytics. And if you look at their evidence indicates that full online education, as we're talking about, are less likely to complete, and that the blended students are more likely to complete than the on-campus. So those are things to keep about. I mean, this is what the students are showing us by their performance. Sometimes we create policy for what we hope the consumers will do rather than what the consumers want to do, and we'll in fact, do for us. I think that's important. Part of the dilemma, though, is that our data on this is not very good. We really don't know for sure, but very often we think we do, and we're developing our policy on our hunches. All of which I think is to suggest, as you move forward, you're leading in this area. Other states are going to be looking at you. I know the states with which I work will be looking at you. We really hope that you will develop the data capacity to determine whether your situation, whether what you adopt works or doesn't. And there are two major efforts in data analytics today that I would bring to your attention. I think both are important. One is data analytics for accountability. It's what we've been doing for 15 years in a big way in all of higher education, and that is to do a better job of collecting data for reporting purposes, for comparative purposes, and for rewarding institutions, most commonly now in terms of performance funding activities. It provides strong incentives for improvement. The other is data analytics for improvement. And this is really less to do with policy and more to do with practice. But it's with this new predictive analytics effort that looks at data to help serve students better tomorrow in the classroom. And both are very important to us and important to you in knowing whether your efforts work. Both require resources. You're going to either have to get new resources. I don't think they're going to be available to you in Florida, so I suspect you're going to have to reallocate resources to this, but it's just critically important that you find the capacity to analyze whether what you do is having the impact that you have. Of course, the benefit of not doing that is you'll be able to claim success for whatever occurs, but I would suggest that you really do try to determine whether it's happening or not. I would also tell you, though, and I go back just a second here, when you get this data, it will be hard for a lot of people to swallow. Because what we're finding is a lot of us, what we're doing isn't quite as good as we thought it was. The third general area is, as we move from quality assurance and accountability, is you want to support innovation. At the very least, you don't want to inhibit innovation from occurring within your system. And so how do we have policy that essentially reinforces innovation? Well, there are a couple of ways. One is through directive activities, through incentive funding. We pay institutions for those things we think will generate the activities that we want through incentive funding for programs that we think will be quality programs, or through regulation, or through mandation. Those are the primary ways that we have often done it. Or now more often we're doing it through the reward for performance, so performance funding efforts or achievement awards and such. But I would tell you these have very different impacts. The second is not nearly as much fun for policymakers because you have to rely on the people within your institutions or your selected approaches to make the difference, and you don't get to make that, tell them what's the best practice. The fourth is you don't want in this to essentially, you want this to strengthen your institutions, not anything else. And while your focus here, I think, should continue to be on the students and the new students you want to serve, you want to make sure that your institutions also remain strong and vital organizations. There are people who say that your institutions are white elephants, that they'll all be gone in 20 years. I don't believe that there's much validity to that, nor do I believe that's where you would want your institutions to be in 20 years. So you want the institutions to remain strong. I'm going to go through the 4 plans very quickly that were laid out by Parthenon to sort of suggest them. With respect to this, I don't need to say much because I think they've done an excellent job of laying this out. But one is the institution-by-institution approach. It's what I'd call a benign because this is essentially what you've been doing today. It should, in principle, be the one that allows for the most innovation and nimbleness over time because it allows all of your institutions to move in this area. And if this is really as good as I tried to lay it out to be, why wouldn't they all be moving aggressively in this regard? But if it's so good, why hasn't it generated more innovation? And I think that's a real important question for us. Now, having said that, you have some real pockets of excellence in online education in Florida. I mentioned the University of Central Florida. You've got other examples as well. So you have achieved some real innovation here. You also, in the aggregate, are well above the rest of the country. In many respects, you have as good as it gets in the nation in public higher education. And so I think there are some things to your credit. But you still have many of your institutions that are not fully engaged in this. And if it's such a good idea and you want more, staying and doing what you do today won't get you there. As Einstein said, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is the definition of insanity. And you guys don't want to be insane. So the second one is basically institutional collaboration. I run an organization that its mission is to provide collaboration between 15 states and the institutions within those. So I've got to say collaboration is a heck of a good idea. It's my business. And it allows institutions to work together and provides the capacity, I think, to move to economies of scale much more rapidly than the institution-by-institution approach. One of the dilemmas, though, is it does jeopardize the vitality of institutions that don't get in the game to play, either aren't asked to be in the collaboration or don't seek to be in collaboration. And if, in fact, we're talking about the wave of the future for American higher education, you probably want to find something where, at least to some extent, all of your institutions can continue to play in the shifts that are taking place. I would also tell you that collaboration is not a natural act in American higher education, and it's hard work. And so it does take time as you move forward. The third is the lead institution approach. I think this is what I'd call a directive approach. It is the ultimate mission differentiation. Most of us in public policy love mission differentiation. I've spent most of my life preaching for it, so it's hard not to argue for this as a viable approach. It assures leadership on the agenda, and it allows the focusing of resources. The dilemma, I think, and I think it is a serious thing to think about, is that it sacrifices the ability of all of your institutions to thrive in this new emerging future of American higher education. And so that's the limitation. The new online institution approach is it does allow you to create a well-branded, clear-missioned institution, and you can see some of that occurring around the country at the present time. What it does, though, is, again, it prevents your existing institutions, which have a substantial gravitas today and branding expertise, from being a part of the plan. It also essentially prevents this new ubiquitous part of our higher education system from being available for application in all of our institutions. And it also, I think, ignores the reality. Now, this wasn't the task you really gave to Parthenon, but it ignores the reality that blended learning is the one that seems to have the highest student learning outcomes at the lowest price. And so it may be that it has some downsides as well as some upsides. So that essentially completes mine. I'm suggesting to you that policy is very important. You need to be very intentional in it. Never lose sight of your original goals. Whenever you're thinking of policy, say, how does this affect our goals? And think of finance policy, which is potentially your strongest lever, so that as you go along, don't ignore issues of quality and accountability. Be intentional in promoting innovation, and really be sure not to undercut the vitality of your existing infrastructure as you move forward into this bold new world. Thanks.
Thank you. Governors, any questions, comments?
I have one comment. It seems to me that we're not necessarily choosing from A, B, C, or D.
Absolutely.
We might choose to do B and C. We might say we need to do a better job for all the universities and colleges to make sure everybody's using the right resources. We want to collaborate better. We want to see better collaboration and shared resources for online amongst all our colleges and universities. And then again, we may also want to do either a new university, which maybe not, or a lead institution for a different product.
I think that's right. I think as you look at these, you'll want to think of how your policies reinforce wherever my last piece, which is how you do it, is up to you guys. But I think you will probably end up with something that is out of this, a blended model. that leads you into the future. I think you want to be sure that you that the benefits exceed the costs.
You mentioned higher accountability for online. Is that just because of its novelty, or do we always envision that to be the case?
No, I think it's partly because of the novelty. Every new innovation, people say, I wonder if that's going to look good or not, if that's going to work. And so I think when you have something that's innovative, it's on the cutting edge, it's disruptive, it raises issues. When it becomes more pro forma, then I think it becomes more accepted. I would hope that my goal for a long time has been to have stronger accountability for traditional higher education. Actually, it's one of my nefarious desires coming out of online, is that if we actually were to develop strong student learning outcomes assessments for online, gosh, who knows, we might actually apply them to on-campus.
Good luck on that.
Yeah.
With that, thank you. Next on the agenda, Dr. Bruce Shallow.
Second time you got it.
Okay. We'll address the national landscape on online education, and he is the CEO of Sloan Consortium. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you. Always good to get back to Florida. Postcard day out there. We were talking about that at lunch. I should add that I'm somewhat like David. For 14 years before joining, taking this new position, I was with SREB, Southern Regional Education Board, the sister organization to WICHE. So my frame of reference tends to be focused more on coordination as well. But I was asked to speak on kind of the national scene, and in fact, I'd argue it's an international scene, and I'll comment on that as we move forward. And I've done that by kind of laying out a series of trends, and I think the point that I would want to make to the governors in your deliberations is these are the kinds of things that you need to be thinking about. Whatever structure you ultimately opt for, and however these cost considerations play out, I think these are the kinds of things that in fact are happening, and we're seeing happening even more so in terms of online learning. So a little kind of middle of the afternoon refresher here. Actually speaking to one of David's comments. So let me just let you take a look at this for a moment. I'm going to make one comment initially that this is not my prediction. I'll tell you whose it is in a moment. I love campuses. They're not going to go away. But essentially that the model that we have today, the traditional model that we have today, will prove unviable in all but a few cases in the next 10 to 15 years. Pretty shocking statement if you think about 39, 40 institutions, certainly in the public sector here in Florida. Well, who was that prediction made by? That was made by an organization called Ernst Young, which most of us have probably heard of, in a report entitled University of the Future, a 1,000-year-old industry on the cusp of profound change. It came out about the time that the Parthenon report, I think, was presented to the leadership in Florida. So I don't know whether they had a chance to see this in advance of their publication. It was based upon a study done in Australia. We're not Australia. That said, we have a lot of the same characteristics. Our systems do have a lot of similarities. And so the question that I pose is, wouldn't this play out in some fashion in the U.S.? I think it will, but to a far lesser extent if, in fact, we start to take advantage of some opportunities that are present. I think this is I think this is a great challenge to us all, but it's also a pretty exciting time to be in the online environment. So they talked about 5 trends driving change. And so just to lay out a little bit of context here, because I think they impact all of us and all of the discussions that, in fact, you were having. The MOOC phenomena probably plays out as best in terms of the democratization of knowledge and access as almost anything. But beyond the MOOCs, because it's now free and so-called free, we'll see over a long period of time, is in fact that there's a whole lot of knowledge extant out there that is in fact not now being generated by or delivered exclusively at the institutional level, whether it's a college or university. And we need to recognize that there are a variety of ways that we can in fact now secure knowledge. It wasn't that long ago when we'd call a university librarian and ask for information on some statistic, and we can Google that and probably have that information within a matter of seconds. To the credit of the librarians of the world, they've adjusted. They've done a marvelous job of embracing the technology. But I think we need to understand that the democratization of knowledge and this access to it has changed and is not going to change back. The marketplace, both nationally and internationally, but let me speak nationally, is ferocious in terms of online. A lot of institutions running headstrong into this activity. There are obviously funding considerations with that. A lot of the debate in the U.S. has been framed around the for-profit institutions. My advice generally to the public sector is let's stop pointing fingers at them and look at what they're doing and try to embrace what they're doing into our public sector, nonprofit, let me use that term, sector activities. We have much we can learn from them. They do a great job, and we have so many advantages over that marketplace brand, longer history, et cetera, so we need to take advantage of that. The digital technologies, not only transforming how and where we learn, but keeping learning on the move, if you will. We are working on bringing the university to devices, and at the same time learning to bring devices to the university. Global mobility, two factors there. One, not only are more and more of the U.S. marketplace moving to the international environment, more and more international institutions are coming to our shores. They have viewed education, many of these countries have viewed education as a commodity. It's exportable, and they've approached this from a very business-like strategy. So we need to be sensitive to issues relating to global mobility. And then I thought the Parthenon study was terrific. They did a great job, I think, for you in laying out a variety of options, lots of good detail in there. They reference this integration with industry, and I would simply make that point that this is also a continuing trend. So three, if you will, broad kind of business models or approaches. And again, I'm not trying to lay out the four that you have plus three more. I'm really trying to look at this in, more broadly in terms of what's happening with online learning. Colleges and universities are not going to go away. I think your challenge is finding the right balance, if you will, in how we streamline the status quo. And in fact, I think that's ultimately where we're all going to end up. Colleges and universities in Florida are going to continue to operate. They're going to continue to have a traditional base of students who come to the campus. I think David's point that he referenced and our research at Sloan suggests that blended is, or hybrid, whichever term you want to use, is in fact probably the preferred and most effective model. It combines the best elements of the online strategies with our traditional campus-based activities. So I do sense that we're probably moving into a streamlined status quo. The niche dominators, it's intriguing because we're being hit now not only by kind of intriguing new models in terms of post-secondary institutions, but a lot of external or outside providers as well. How many of you have heard of straighter line? Pay a flat fee, pay a little monthly fee, come in and take as many credits as you want, accumulate those credits, you get recommendations. If you have not been to their website recently, you should go there because one of the things that they've done very effectively and very successfully over the last several months is they've signed up institutions. So not only now are they saying, come and go through these processes with us for the accumulation of credit, they're not saying then take it onto the open market and let's go to a Florida institution. They're saying, why don't you go to one of the institutions that we've aligned ourselves with, and we'll ensure that, in fact, the credits that you've accumulated through straighter line, you, in fact, can use at those institutions. And then, thirdly, the kind of the transformers.
Sir, can I ask you?
Sure.
What's the cost of straight line? Are those, are they,
I think it's, there's a flat fee of a couple $100, and then like $39 a course. It's done on a monthly basis. I should have mentioned, they've been promoting, I saw an ad from them about a month ago, that you can take your freshman year experience for $999. So essentially, they're selling the Gen Ed first 30 hours of an undergraduate experience for $999. Yeah, it's the organization or the company's called Straighter Line. They're not a degree granting institution, so they do not deal with accreditation. They're working with institutions that already have accreditation of some type of accreditation. And then finally, the transformers. Private providers and new entrants will carve out new positions in these traditional markets. Straighter Line is an example of those. There are emerging new learner business models that will change the breadth of programs and the array of programs that are colleges and universities. I think one of the real challenges that we have in whatever model you adopt, and Governor, I think your comments at the end of David's remarks with this notion of picking and choosing from various elements within the four that were outlined, ultimately starts getting you towards a strategy that builds upon what you're already doing, allows for innovation, allows you to direct. I think David did a great job of talking about directing either your financial resources or your policy construct towards those institutions. I'm intrigued by, as someone who's now kind of focused in an organization that is about promoting and expanding the integration of online learning into the mainstream of higher education, these kinds of headlines, and you've probably seen most of them, seem to have captured not only the higher education community's interest, but the general public's interest. Nothing sells online learning like having a cover on Time magazine a couple of months ago. And I've had that Time magazine cover held up on many occasions. And there are a variety of states, not only Florida, that are looking at issues relating to how this is going to change. My favorite being School's Out Forever. The song, we could break out the song if we wanted to. So why the recent hype? Well, it's because education, higher education, is now free. There's a good biology course at Stanford University we heard about. There are 161,000 students who took Sebastian Thrun's artificial intelligence course last fall. But Sebastian would also tell you, we didn't have many students who finished. It's an experiment. So part of the intrigue with the MOOCs, you serve large numbers of students, they are free, and now we've seen this movement of prestige, but however you want to define that, name institutions, high quality colleges, universities, public and private, that have moved into the MOOC business. And when you try to talk to them about what are they doing, the comments seem to be, others are doing it, so we need to be sure that we don't get left on the sideline. So there's a bit of a herd mentality here. I would suggest to you that there are MOOCish kinds of things that you can and should be doing or thinking about with respect to whatever model you develop within the state of Florida. The reality is they've opened the world's eyes to online learning, and that's not a bad thing. Is this going to transform higher education? I don't know if it's going to transform higher education. It's going to impact higher education. It's impacting you already. It's impacting the kinds of discussions you're having. It's impacted, even in the report from Parthenon, that, and there's this kind of MOOC activity that is ongoing here. I'd argue, however, that our real challenges, and I would take this not only out of the context of online and into more broadly into higher education, is we're dealing with increasing costs to the student, lower support in the public sector from states or the federal government, that we have a graduation rate where roughly 40% of our adult population has an associate degree, 40%. That varies from state to state. Much of the work that I've been involved with over the last few years has been trying to get that huge population of students who started in colleges and universities and who dropped out for a variety of reasons to come back. There's a real market there and a significant market, and I know there's work ongoing in Florida. So we've got a track record. and I think for the first time that I can recall in my engagement in this marvelous industry of ours, the value proposition of higher education is being questioned. That elasticity, David, that you talked about, there are some questions about whether or not we've stretched that rubber band just about as far economically as we can get it. When you start hearing about the indebtedness of students as they leave our colleges and universities, used to be at the graduate and professional level you'd hear those figures, now you're hearing them coming out of our 2- and 4-year institutions. And this question about, is the value of what we are getting out of our higher education what we need to be getting for the investment that we're making? So let me finish up in my time here with some trends that I think already are impacting where we're going. Again, some of them were referenced in the Parthenon study, but just to give you kind of another perspective beyond that report. I think we're moving much more towards this notion of learning is learning. Whether it's online or delivered in a classroom or delivered in a blended format, learning is learning. We do have the challenge, and it's been pointed out a couple of times, that our data structures and our tracking mechanisms are not well suited to making those kinds of distinctions. And again, David mentioned the University of Central Florida. I just want to underscore the point that he made. One of the reasons why people look at UCF, with all due respect to the other institutions, they've got mountains of data. They've been tracking this from day one when they started this activity. And most of us outside of the state of Florida actually look to UCF in terms of kind of tracking where they've gone because of their data analytics, if you will. The technology tools, as we've heard about, are ubiquitous and becoming more mobile. I made the comment we're still struggling, I think, with getting our universities into Mobi, but more and more of that's going to happen. There are a couple of really difficult challenges, and the third bullet here on the faculty acceptance and development is a continuing challenge. It was great to see referenced in the Parthenon report a study that Sloan started 9 years ago by the Babson Survey Research. And just as an aside, that came about because people were asking the question, is anyone really taking online courses out there? That's literally how the funding for that initial study started, and it's grown to be what it is. We do track faculty acceptance. If you look at one data point in terms of academic leadership and its strategic importance, it's upwards of 70% of institutional leaders are saying this stuff is really important to our future, and yet you still see faculty, if not resistance, then at least not embracing online learning. And the organization I'm now with is really kind of focused on trying to bring the faculty along as we move forward. I've mentioned competitors. Significant number of new competitors almost on a daily or weekly basis. Second point, competency-based learning. It's been referenced here. It is hot, and I don't think it's going to go away. And it essentially, there was reference to the $10,000 Texas degree earlier. If you start looking at what they're trying to do with the 10K degree, they're saying, well, if you take advanced placement, if you take dual enrollment, if you do competency-based learning, you can start to accumulate credits. And you can accumulate credits at a very low or almost no cost based upon your ability to demonstrate these competencies. The data is clear that for most adults who are returning, they want competency opportunities. They want to at least have options for it. And I think one of the things that you should be doing in your model is to be looking at how you can do that. Badging and other strategies and new assessment tools. Badging when I was a Cub Scout was a big deal. I'd never thought it would come back in the way that it has. My grandsons would probably love to get their hands on the badges, but I didn't have many badges. I didn't do many of those things very well. But this is a big deal, and the challenge for us in terms of the institutions is, are you, as an institution, going to recognize those badges? Can you start to pull and pull those badges together that in fact could lead to credit? Recognition of credit. If whatever happens with the MOOCs, you're going to have students who are going to show up on your doorstep saying, I took this MOOC course from MIT in electrical engineering, or I took this Stanford biology course. I, in fact, should be getting credit for this. It's led now to a study supported by the Gates Foundation with ACE to look at credits for MOOCs. Credits are a big deal, obviously. Alternative programs to reduce the cost of higher education. I mentioned Straighter Line as being one. Time is expense. Simple concept, but think about that for a moment. The more time we have in a seat, the more the cost to the individual student, the more cost to institutions and systems. The challenge becomes, and I don't have a quick answer, certainly don't have a silver bullet answer here. The question becomes, if we in fact move those students out of the traditional classroom, how do we counterbalance that in terms of the need to put students, or enroll students, and put them in seats? Faculty roles, I mentioned this earlier, mention it once again. They will change, will continue to change. It's going to be fueled in part by the MOOCs. How courses are offered, when they're offered, and in particular the size and scope of offerings. So I kind of skirted a lot of the policy issues. David did a nice job with those. One of the policy constructs that is a real challenge for us at the state and institutional level, Florida and pick any state, is that we have built a policy construct around a traditional model that essentially says you go for 15 weeks in a semester, and then you go for another semester, and you put 8 of those together, and we're going to give you a baccalaureate degree. Problem is, that doesn't work for the vast majority of students. Does not work for the vast majority of students. And then we have the added challenge of how large can classes get? Well, they can be 15 in a graduate course, or they can be 161,000 in an artificial intelligence course. That MOOC again. Recognizing new learning approaches, as David suggested. Accountability, I'm not going to comment on that. David did a great job talking about that. That is driving us in every state. Intriguing to look around many of the southern states that are kind of moving their models away from just, we're going to fund you at the FTE front end on access, and we're going to, and we know we need to do some of that. We're going to reward you more at the other end for those who you can, in fact, get through degree completion. Changes in accreditation. I'm not going to beat up on the work and skill-oriented degree programs that are tied to your workforce. I thought that part of the Parthenon report was excellent, and something that we are pushing, if you will, for states to give consideration to. New and shorter pathways to degrees. How many people have heard of Rio Salado College? Part of the Maricopa Community College system in Phoenix, Arizona. They start courses every Monday. They start new courses every Monday. They have 60 or so thousand students, have 28 full-time faculty. I get more questions about Rio Salado when I'm out talking to folks than now they got a huge adjunct base. I'm not arguing that we should in fact throw away all of our faculty and go to an adjunct base. I am suggesting that there are strategies that they're utilizing to serve their students, creating these new pathways. Clear evidence from any of the survey research that I've seen with online learners, particularly adult learners, they don't like 15-week semesters. They want 10 or 8 or 5, and those are being pushed. Graduate education was referenced in the report. It is continuing to move towards practice. I spent 15 years in graduate education, fighting my colleagues on the main campus in Blacksburg, where they said we've got to bring the students here. And I was saying, yeah, but you're paying $12,500 for them to study for a couple of years of the graduate research or teaching assistantship. These people are living in the Washington, D.C. area, have high-paying jobs, and we need to find a program that, in fact, will help meet their needs. Online learning can, in fact, do that. So a couple of challenging questions. My questions to you, not that you don't have enough questions already. Can we integrate our campus-based experiences and use those technologies and available tools that students want to use? I think you're about that task. The restructuring of our time-based models, I think, is essential, particularly in reaching alternative markets. But I think you're going to see this push for more and more, even kind of traditional-age students. The business industry model, can we restore faith in our industry, if I can consider higher education as an industry, among the public? I think that is a huge challenge for us. But in the end, I think the greatest challenge, whatever you ultimately decide in terms of the structure, is we're talking about changing culture here. We're talking about moving the higher education industry, if you will, that's been in existence for hundreds and hundreds of years, and moving it into a very kind of different mode, if you will. Not only about online, I would argue, but more broadly about all of our instructional activities. And can we balance the needs of the public, the demands of our students, the requirements of our policymakers, the interest of our faculty and our local academic communities, and can we crack open this so-called iron triangle of cost, access, and quality, which essentially has said, well, if you want us to be better in quality, then we can't get it done with cost and access the way it is, or if you want to increase access, we can't do it with quality and cost. So, your opportunity. I want to say what David said and what others have said. We, as a product of a couple of fine universities, and one daughter, one son-in-law, and the grandkids are on the way. We're going to send them to Florida and pay out of state tuition. You got a lot of pieces in place. You really have a lot of pieces in place. Everyone has said that, and I hope you embrace that, because then becomes a matter of really how do you start to kind of move or orient those resources. Lots of options for you to consider. It's just the right time to be considering it, this online environment. If some folks a few years ago thought it was going to go away, it is not going to go away. And you can learn from others, but the Florida model is one, I think, that ought to have the distinctiveness and the uniqueness of the resources, the institutions, and your student needs at hand. So I will just conclude with this changing environment. I think I mentioned all of these, so I'm not going to repeat them. I would add 2 points. One, be sure that whatever you do, it is not cast in concrete. You need to maintain some flexibility and nimbleness as you move forward. Obviously, you will make it responsive to Floridians. Continue to focus on quality. Your institutions are high-quality institutions. Do not lose that in any of these discussions. Good luck. Look forward to...
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks. Fitting final comment. How about questions or comments? Anyone? Well done.
Great, thanks.
One question. Has anybody looked at the need?
Norm, can we get the mic?
Anybody looked at the need in the state of Florida for us to partner with the state system of colleges? Do we get better if we have the universities and the state colleges collaborating? Because I haven't heard anything about that. We got two huge systems out there.
There are probably others in the room who are more capable of that's a great question, responding to the question. My tendency is to look broadly at the array of institutions. I'm still trying to get over the fact that all of the old community colleges change to state colleges, but I'm getting there. I think I have most of the names down. I would see this as a much larger collaborative. I think it could easily address some of the questions that were raised earlier about access and admissions, and this could be done, I think, in a very collaborative way. I think David pointed that out in his remarks. So, but that probably is a question that can come back up, I think, when we have this other panel and some of the other system folks are involved. Just my view.
Bruce, thank you. Look forward to working with you in the months ahead. Thank you. The next item on the agenda is going to be a panel discussion, and we have a series of four questions that we're going to be presenting to the panel to generate some discussion. But before we do that, let me introduce the members of the panel. We have Chancellor Hanna, Dr. Glover, Dr. Moore stepped out. He'll be back in a second. Susan Paragus and Dr. Wachter, correct? So what the format's going to be, we've got 4 questions. We've got an hour and a half for this, but I'd like to have the panel discussion in about an hour, which would give us about 15 minutes per question, which would give us 30 minutes for dialogue. And David and Bruce, I think you're going to respond to each of the questions and give your observations after you've heard the panelists' comments. And what I thought we would do is start with Randy and then just work this way and then move down with each question, and then we'll all have an opportunity to talk. And then if we don't keep our comments brief, the last person will be shorted. So this will be an incentive to keep everyone's comments brief.